March 10, 1945. Just past midnight, the restless city of Tokyo lay shrouded in the thick, choking haze of winter smoke and the distant glow of fires from earlier air raids. The streets, nearly deserted, carried only the echo of hurried footsteps, the occasional rattle of tram tracks, and the faint hum of generators struggling against blackout restrictions. From his command post atop a reinforced concrete bunker in the outskirts of the city, Lieutenant General Masakazu Kawabe scanned the night sky with binoculars, the cold biting through his uniform. The tension in the room was almost tangible. The Imperial Japanese Army had grown accustomed to warnings, sirens, and the occasional distant bombing, but something told Kawabe that this night would mark a turning point. High above the jagged skyline of Tokyo, a new threat approached. Not the familiar silhouette of the B-29 flying fortress, which had once struck terror into the hearts of the Japanese populace, nor the low-flying, nimble Mitsubishi Zero fighters that patrolled the skies with their familiar shriek. This was different. The B-29 Superfortress, a monstrous machine from across the Pacific, cut through the stratosphere with an almost clinical precision. At 30,000 feet, it was nearly untouchable. Kawabe's eyes followed the faint pinpricks of light tracing arcs across the heavens. Somewhere up there, thousands of pounds of destruction were being guided closer to his home city, and there was nothing he could do. Inside the command post, maps littered the tables, marked with red ink denoting previous raids and defensive positions. Kawabe's staff fidgeted nervously, aware of the gravity of this new threat. They had heard reports of the B-29's capabilities, flying higher than any interceptor could reach, armed with heavier bombs than any fighter could carry, and most importantly, capable of striking directly at the heart of Japan. No air raid shelter, no anti-aircraft battery, no desperate tactical maneuver could reliably stop it. The realization settled over Kawabe like a dense fog. The war that had once seemed winnable, at least defensively, was now slipping through their fingers. The first distant roar of the B-29 engines reached the ears of those on the ground, a sound unlike anything previously experienced. It was both mechanical and alien, reverberating with a cold metallic authority that seemed to mock the defensive measures of Tokyo's air units. Kawabe's hand instinctively tightened around the edge of the binoculars. He knew immediately that this was no ordinary raid. This was a harbinger. Every report he had received, every reconnaissance photo, every intelligence briefing about American strategic capabilities suddenly coalesced into a single, unbearable truth. Japan's homeland could no longer be considered safe. Outside, the night sky shimmered with the distant flare of anti-aircraft shells, blooming silently before fading into the darkness. Fighters scrambled from makeshift airstrips, climbing desperately, their pilots straining to reach altitudes where the B-29 might be intercepted. Below, civilians whispered prayers and prayed for miracles that had long since abandoned them. Kawabe did not flinch. His role demanded composure, yet inside, a cold dread took root. He understood instinctively that this was a technological and psychological watershed. The war had reached a point where survival of the nation itself was in question. As the massive bomber crested the horizon, silhouetted against the faint glow of Tokyo's city lights, Kawabe's heart sank. Every line etched into his face, every rank badge gleaming under the dim lamplight seemed suddenly insignificant against the magnitude of the threat. The B-29's approach was methodical, almost clinical, its engines drowning out every other sound in the sky. This was not just an aircraft. It was a statement. America had developed a weapon that could deliver destruction from heights Japanese defenses could not contest, and the implications were unthinkable. For a moment, Kawabe allowed himself to imagine the city beneath that metal leviathan, homes, temples, schools, and hospitals all vulnerable to a single unimpeded strike. And then, the thought that chilled him to his very core: if Tokyo could not be defended, what hope remained for the rest of the empire? The first B-29 over Tokyo was more than a tactical problem. It was a psychological weapon, a stark, unyielding signal that the tide of war had irrevocably turned. Kawabe had seen it, felt it, and in that instant he knew Japan's war, once fought with pride and hope, was nearing its inexorable end. Kawabe stepped back from the binoculars, rubbing his temples as if to erase the image of the enormous bomber seared into his mind. In the dim glow of the command post, officers whispered hurriedly among themselves, their voices a mixture of fear, disbelief, and mounting frustration. Reports were being relayed via radio from scattered observation posts. The B-29s were arriving in unprecedented numbers, high and fast, dropping incendiaries with devastating accuracy. Every interception attempt by Japanese fighters had been ineffective. The enemy's technological advantage was absolute. The lieutenant general moved to the large wooden table at the center of the room, spreading his hands over a map of Tokyo and the surrounding prefectures. Red pins marked the locations of anti-aircraft batteries, the meager interceptor squadrons, and the major industrial complexes. But the map now felt meaningless. How could a citywide network of guns and planes hope to reach aircraft that operated miles above their effective range? Even the famed Nakajima Ki-84 Frank fighters, fast and agile, could scarcely reach the altitude of these high-flying monstrosities. Kawabe traced a trembling finger along the flight path of the B-29 and sighed. His mind raced through defensive scenarios, diverting planes from other airfields, reinforcing flak batteries, coordinating with civilian fire brigades, but each option seemed increasingly futile. The calculations were brutal and cold. One B-29 carried a payload capable of leveling entire neighborhoods, and they could strike at will, night or day, virtually untouchable. He felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the recognition that Japan's defensive strategy had been rendered obsolete overnight. Outside the bunker, the city shuddered beneath the distant explosions. Fires from previous raids had already claimed entire blocks, but the sound of the new B-29's payloads landing further heightened the sense of helplessness. Civilian screams, mingled with the wail of air raid sirens, penetrated the reinforced walls of the command post. Kawabe knew the psychological impact on the population was as severe as the physical damage. Morale, once a cornerstone of national resilience, was crumbling rapidly. The people were beginning to understand that their homes, their families, and their lives were no longer safe. Kawabe's chief of staff, Colonel Hiroshi Takeda, approached cautiously, his face pale under the dim lamplight. "General," he whispered, "the reports confirm that B-29s are flying in formations larger than anticipated. They are maintaining altitudes above 30,000 feet and our fighters cannot engage effectively." His voice trailed off, heavy with unspoken fear. Kawabe nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of the information. He had known on an abstract level that American air power had advanced, but seeing it in the flesh, witnessing the precision and scale, brought an undeniable, sinking certainty. For the first time, Kawabe allowed himself to consider the broader implications. Factories essential to the war effort were now within reach of near-invulnerable bombers. Naval yards, fuel depots, and even key communication hubs were exposed. If Tokyo, the heart of the empire, could not be protected, then what hope remained for Osaka, Nagoya, or the far-flung islands? Each thought was a dagger to his resolve, yet he forced himself to maintain composure. Orders needed to be issued, strategies adjusted, and the illusion of command preserved, even if the war's outcome now felt inevitable. As dawn crept over the horizon, the first B-29s vanished into the early morning clouds, leaving behind a city marked with smoke and fire. Kawabe stepped out onto the observation deck, the wind biting through his coat, and surveyed the devastated skyline. He felt a profound mixture of awe and dread, an understanding that the war had entered a new and terrifying phase. No longer was Japan merely fighting an enemy across distant seas. Now the battlefield was domestic, and the enemy could strike with impunity. Kawabe closed his eyes for a brief moment, imagining the aircraft's approach from his own perspective. The sheer scale, the mechanical inevitability of it, this was not a fight that could be won with valor alone. He realized that the war had shifted irreversibly. Technological supremacy, long a distant concept, was now the determining factor. Every calculation, every deployment, every desperate maneuver would be measured against the shadow of the B-29. And in that shadow, he knew the truth. Japan had seen the future of the war, and it was grim. By mid-morning, Tokyo was eerily quiet, as if the city itself had been holding its breath. Smoke still drifted from fires started in previous raids, curling upward into a pale gray sky. Kawabe returned to his command post, the heavy feeling in his chest refusing to lift. Outside, air raid sirens wailed intermittently, sending ripples of tension through the scattered civilians who dared to move along the streets. Then came the sound he had been dreading, the distant, relentless droning of the B-29 engines, steadily approaching at altitudes his defenses could barely touch. The first strike began with almost surgical precision. Incendiary bombs rained down in calculated waves, igniting buildings with startling speed. Wooden homes, cramped apartments, and industrial warehouses became tinder in a city unprepared for such a relentless high-altitude assault. Flames leaped skyward, casting an ominous glow over the darkened streets. Kawabe, standing over the city on the observation deck, could almost feel the heat despite the altitude. Each explosion was a hammer blow, not only against infrastructure but against the very psyche of the nation. Colonel Takeda relayed the incoming damage reports with a tense voice. "General, the firestorms are spreading faster than anticipated. The civilians in the low-lying districts have no effective shelter. Emergency services are overwhelmed." Kawabe's hand rested on the map, tracing the path of destruction. The scale of the damage was incomprehensible. Entire neighborhoods once bustling with life were now smoldering wastelands. He felt an almost physical ache as he recognized familiar landmarks engulfed in flames, the city he had known since youth. Now under siege from above, Japanese fighters attempted interception, but their efforts were tragically insufficient. The Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar and Mitsubishi Ki-51 Sonya climbed frantically, engines screaming at the limits, yet they could barely approach the B-29s. Anti-aircraft batteries fired blindly into the sky, their shells reaching only fragments of the enemy formations. Each explosion that failed to hit its mark resonated like a drumbeat of futility. Kawabe's mind struggled to reconcile the bravery of his pilots with the impossibility of their task. In the command post, officers scrambled to adjust defensive plans, but the options were almost laughably inadequate. Kawabe considered dispatching reserve units moving civilian populations, even coordinating a counter-offensive, but every strategy was constrained by the simple, unalterable fact: these bombers operated far above the effective range of all Japanese countermeasures. He realized with grim clarity that the defensive war he had been trained for was now irrelevant. The B-29 was a weapon designed not just to destroy but to demoralize, and it was succeeding beyond measure. The fires spread unchecked, consuming factories, warehouses, and residential blocks in a terrifying chain reaction. Smoke thickened the air, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few dozen meters. Kawabe could hear distant cries for help carried on the wind, the voices of a city trapped between despair and disbelief. His officers averted their eyes, unwilling to confront the human toll of the attack directly, yet Kawabe stood rigid, taking in every detail: the patterns of the fires, the faltering attempts at defense, the helplessness in the streets. Each moment cemented the painful realization that Japan's defenses had been outclassed. By late morning, the first wave had passed, leaving Tokyo battered, smoking, and demoralized. Kawabe allowed himself a rare moment of quiet reflection, staring at the ruins beneath him. The precision of the strike, the altitude, the speed. It was unlike any previous assault Japan had endured. The city was no longer merely a target. It was a symbol of vulnerability. And within Kawabe, a heavy truth solidified: Japan's war could not be fought on hope or courage alone. The first B-29 had crossed the sky, and with it a silent, inescapable verdict had been delivered. By late afternoon, the air over Tokyo had cleared, but the devastation left in the B-29's wake was unmistakable. Kawabe walked among his staff, each officer silent, their usual confident bearing replaced by a tense, haunted demeanor. The reports from reconnaissance units detailed not only the physical damage, but the chilling accuracy of the raids. Factories critical to aircraft production, fuel depots, and warehouses storing munitions had been obliterated. Roads and rail lines were disrupted, leaving supply lines fractured and emergency response virtually paralyzed. It was one thing to fight an enemy across oceans. It was quite another to feel the enemy's shadow fall directly over your own homeland. Kawabe returned to the observation deck as the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in ominous hues of orange and gray. Smoke from the day's bombing still lingered in thick plumes, the acrid scent of charred wood and burning paper carried on the wind. From this vantage, he could see the charred outlines of entire neighborhoods, their structures reduced to skeletal remains. Civilians, some in shock, some desperately attempting to salvage possessions, moved through the ruins like ghosts. The psychological weight of what he witnessed pressed down on him with an almost physical force. Inside the command post, Kawabe convened an emergency council. Generals, colonels, and staff officers gathered around maps illuminated by flickering lanterns. For hours, they debated potential responses, intercepting future raids, bolstering anti-aircraft batteries, and coordinating with airfield defenses. Yet every scenario seemed inadequate against the B-29's altitude, speed, and precision. Colonel Takeda, usually a composed strategist, leaned heavily against the table, voice taut with frustration. "General, no matter how we reposition our forces, they remain untouchable. Every strike we plan is merely reactive. We cannot reach them." Kawabe listened silently, nodding with grim acceptance. He had long prided himself on meticulous planning, on turning battlefield intelligence into tactical advantage. But here, in the shadow of the first B-29 strike, he confronted a brutal reality. Japan's war machine had been rendered obsolete. It was not lack of courage or skill that had doomed them, but a technological leap that placed the enemy above their reach. Each calculation, each defensive plan was now a futile gesture against inevitability. In a moment of quiet introspection, Kawabe considered the human cost. The civilians, unaware of the strategic calculations behind military decisions, bore the brunt of these attacks. Entire families, neighborhoods, and businesses had been annihilated with mechanical precision. The B-29 was not just a bomber. It was a symbol of the unrelenting force now bearing down upon Japan. Kawabe felt a mixture of despair and helplessness. The war that had begun with ambition and nationalistic pride was now being waged against a population that had no defenses adequate to withstand it. As evening descended, Kawabe stepped out to survey the city once more. Fires smoldered in the distance while the first stars appeared faintly above the smoke. The B-29s had already withdrawn beyond the horizon, but their impact lingered like a shadow over every street and building. Kawabe realized that this single aircraft and the forces behind it had transformed the entire nature of the conflict. The homeland was no longer inviolable, the myth of safety shattered. For the first time, the notion of total defeat entered his mind not as speculation, but as a palpable truth. The commanders remained silent, each grappling privately with the implications. Kawabe's thoughts were heavy, tracing the path of the enemy's aircraft, imagining the endless sorties yet to come. He knew that Japan could no longer fight purely with courage, ingenuity, or stubborn resolve. The calculus had changed. In the high-altitude sky over Tokyo, the enemy had written a new rule. Technological supremacy dictated survival. And in that moment, Kawabe understood something he could not ignore. The war for Japan's very existence had entered a phase from which there could be no easy return. The night after the first B-29 strike, Tokyo was silent in a way that felt unnatural. The wails of sirens had faded, replaced by the crackle of distant fires and the occasional groan of collapsing structures. Kawabe sat alone in his office, the map of the city spread before him, still marked with red pins and smudged with ash. The pattern of destruction was precise, almost surgical, and the implications gnawed at him relentlessly. Each strategic target that had been obliterated was more than just a factory or depot. It was a symbol of Japanese resilience and national pride now reduced to rubble. Kawabe's thoughts turned to the civilians, the mothers clutching children, the elderly huddled in basements, the workers who had poured their lives into factories now reduced to ruins. He imagined their terror as they looked skyward, seeing only the distant glint of B-29s high above, knowing they were defenseless. This was psychological warfare as much as physical. The Americans had managed to project power directly into the hearts and minds of Japan's citizens without losing a single bomber to interception. Kawabe felt a weight settle in his chest, the crushing realization that the enemy was now capable of reaching them wherever they were. Even among his own officers, the mood had shifted. The men who once spoke confidently of defense strategies now moved quietly, their eyes darting nervously toward the observation posts, as if expecting the sky itself to betray them. Discussions of morale, previously perfunctory, now carried an urgent undertone. How could one inspire courage in a populace whose homes and workplaces were now demonstrably vulnerable to unchallengeable attacks from above? Kawabe knew that fear could spread faster than fire, and that psychological defeat often preceded physical collapse. At dawn, reports of scattered skirmishes reached the command post. Japanese fighters had attempted another interception but were repelled, suffering minor losses while inflicting no meaningful damage. Kawabe studied the data carefully. The B-29s flew at altitudes Japanese aircraft could not reach, with bomb loads that left devastation in their wake. Each failed engagement reinforced an unavoidable truth. The war was no longer winnable in conventional terms. He felt an uncomfortable shift within himself, a subtle transition from strategic calculation to somber acceptance. Kawabe convened a private meeting with his senior staff. The tone was different this time. No longer the rapid-fire exchange of orders and reports, but a muted discussion heavy with reluctant acknowledgement of reality. Colonel Takeda voiced what everyone was thinking, but afraid to admit. "General, our defenses are inadequate. Our pilots are brave, but they cannot match the altitude, range, or payload of these aircraft. The Americans now control the skies over our homeland." Kawabe remained silent, absorbing the words. They were not merely facts, they were a verdict. Outside, the city began to stir, but the movement was subdued. People emerged cautiously from shelters, surveying their neighborhoods with expressions of disbelief and resignation. Fires still burned in the distance, filling the streets with smoke that carried a scent of despair. Kawabe walked among the ruins later that morning, observing the physical and emotional aftermath. Faces etched with exhaustion and fear met his gaze, a reminder that the consequences of technological supremacy extended far beyond the battlefield. By mid-morning, the psychological weight of the B-29's arrival had begun to settle across Tokyo like a heavy shroud. Citizens whispered in hushed tones about the invincible enemy above. Soldiers and officers alike moved with a measured caution that betrayed uncertainty. Kawabe understood the dual role of the Superfortress. It was a weapon of destruction and a harbinger of inevitable defeat. The first B-29 had crossed Japanese skies and, with it, shattered the illusion of homeland security. Every calculation, every plan, every strategy now existed under the shadow of a single, undeniable truth. The war could no longer be won. By the evening of the second day after the first B-29 strike, Tokyo resembled a city caught between memory and ruin. The fires had largely subsided, but the smoke hung in the air, curling through shattered windows and over flattened streets. Kawabe stood atop the command post once more, the weight of the past 48 hours pressing down on him. The magnitude of what he had witnessed, the destruction, the civilian terror, the futility of interception, was no longer theoretical. It was real, and in that moment he understood with chilling clarity. The war was lost. Inside the post, his staff worked in tense silence, marking damaged areas, calculating future targets, and attempting to patch together strategies that were, in truth, powerless against the new reality. Kawabe observed them, knowing that their skill and courage honed over decades could not change the outcome. The B-29 had rewritten the rules of warfare. No longer was it a question of bravery, numbers, or cunning. The American bombers had demonstrated technological and logistical superiority that Japan could not counter in time to prevent catastrophic loss. Kawabe's mind wandered back to the moment he first saw the B-29, silhouette against the horizon, the monstrous wings cutting through the sky with terrifying grace. He remembered the mechanical roar of the engines, the sense of inevitability that had gripped him then. That singular moment had stripped away any remaining illusions about the war's trajectory. It was not defeat in the abstract, but defeat in the tangible, unavoidable form. The enemy had found a way into the very heart of Japan, and there was nothing left to prevent them. Even as officers tried to rationalize future defensive actions, Kawabe had begun to contemplate the broader implications. The empire's industrial capabilities were vulnerable, cities were exposed, and civilian morale was deteriorating rapidly. Each subsequent B-29 sortie would only magnify the damage, breaking not just infrastructure, but the spirit of the nation. The reality was stark. Japan was now on the defensive in a war that had once been fought with offensive ambition, and the high-altitude bombers had rendered that ambition moot. Kawabe's reflection was interrupted by reports of the next wave of B-29s assembling over the Pacific. He knew that in hours, perhaps even minutes, they would be over Japanese soil again. But the dread he felt was no longer panic, it was acceptance. He had seen the enemy, understood their capabilities, and confronted the truth that Japan could not overcome them with its current arsenal or tactics. The B-29 symbolized more than destruction. They were the embodiment of inevitable defeat. As night fell, Kawabe finally allowed himself to record his observations in a private journal, a rare act of personal reflection amid the chaos of command. He wrote of the first sighting, the overwhelming sense of power and inevitability, and the fear that had gripped both military personnel and civilians alike. Yet he also wrote of a strange clarity, the understanding that history had shifted, and that Japan's fate had been irrevocably altered by a weapon that could strike from above, without fear of reprisal. From the observation deck, Kawabe gazed at the darkened Tokyo skyline, dotted with fires and still simmering smoke. The first B-29 had flown over, and in doing so had demonstrated the futility of further resistance. The war that had consumed so many lives and so much pride was now, in his eyes, drawing to its inevitable conclusion. And though Kawabe carried the burden of command and the weight of his nation's suffering, he knew the truth. Japan had glimpsed the future in the form of a single, unstoppable bomber, and it was a future defined by loss.